The Cyclops was a giant beast of mythology, and it had one huge eye in the centre of its head that stared at people menacingly. And in this video, which is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus, more of that later, I'm going to be talking about how they might actually have had depth perception, because a lot of people might say to themselves, you can easily defeat a Cyclops. No depth perception, you see. Can't throw anything with any accuracy. No depth perception. But perhaps they did. Perhaps they did have depth perception. But how can something with only one eye have depth perception? Because we, with our two eyes, we're used to stereoscopic binocular vision. We are predators. We can tell that because we've got two eyes at the front of our heads, and we can triangulate. So the brain can compare the picture of the two eyes and say, well, things look pretty similar in that eye and that eye, so they're probably far away. But oh, wait a minute, these two things look quite different in the two pictures I'm looking at, so it's probably quite close. And so we get this feeling, a 3D world around us. As I'm looking at the camera now, I've got a sort of feeling about how far away it is. So how could something with only one eye have depth perception? Well, there are several ways of doing it. I'm going to suggest about 7 in this video. Now, the first one, bit of a cheat actually. I'm not going to claim to be proud of this one, but you may as well start simply. So if the head's really big, right, it's a giant, then the eye could be the size of a human head, in which case there's room to put a pair of eyes on the eye. So the eyeball could actually have two eyes set in it. They could even have their own little eyeballs and swivel within the greater thing, in which case it would look a little bit like this, you see. Yeah, and I use myself as a model, why shouldn't I? And yes, that would work, but it's a bit dodging the issue, isn't it? You could say, well, oh yeah, that's not really a Cyclops, that's just something with one big eyeball that actually has two eyes in it. It's got two eyes, that's not a Cyclops. Cyclops means round-eyed, it doesn't mean one eye, but it's got to have one eye to be proper. And so, all right, so you could say that on that one big eyeball, you could have two pupils, two holes to let the light in which case it would look a little like this. Still looking a little silly, I'll grant you. But still, you'd have to have some way for the brain to differentiate the two different pictures coming through those two holes. So you'd have to have some way of splitting the two image, maybe two retinas, in which case really it's sort of two eyes in one eye again. So that's not a very satisfactory design. Now, one thing that a Cyclops could do is it could do what the beasts in Ray Harryhausen movies always used to do, and that is to, well, in the Harryhausen movies, if you don't know them, by the way, they're Jason and the Argonauts and Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger and those ones. They didn't want the big beast to just step in, stamp on someone and walk off again. No. They wanted the orchestra to play menacing music, and they wanted it to come in slowly, and then it would stand there doing this sort of thing. It would look around. It would look around and pull faces, and it would lean back and go forwards and put its head from side to side. Now I know why. It's because they wanted you to draw out the drama, but it's also because I've done some stop animation. One of the hardest things to do is lifting a foot and taking a stride. So if you've got a model which is just standing on its own 2 feet fixed in place, you can then move its joints above that platform to your heart's content, and that's actually quite easy to do. I know I've done quite a bit of stop animation. Here's an example of my work. You can go and see more of it, but it's a bit little low res actually. Possibly I should upload it again higher res now that I can. Anyway, why would the Cyclops do that? Well, it's because if you move around like that, then you're creating something similar to the effect of having two eyes. The things which are close to you will move a lot relative to you as you do this, but the distance will hardly move at all. And so this gives you quite a good idea of depth, of depth perception. So you can try it right now. You can close one eye and you can move around, and you can see, oh yeah, you don't actually have to move very much. And things that are close to you are quite easy to see that they're very close because of the way they move exactly in sync with your own movements. And because your brain knows what movements you're making, because it's just ordered them, it's very good at spotting the similarity, the match, you know, like the correlation between the movement of the world and the movement that it itself has generated. So that would actually work. So one thing that a Cyclops could do is just walk along like this, and that would give it a 3D world. And when it stood still, it could perhaps just have this habit of moving like this, so that it got that sense of depth perception. But wouldn't it be better to be more conserving of energy, better at perhaps hiding in the darkness? Because we're often told that they lived underground in caves. The most famous example, Polyphemus, who imprisoned Odysseus and his ship's crew, he lived in a dark cave. So it's reasonable to imagine that they might want to be stealthy, these monsters, these creatures that perhaps attack from ambush. So a solution which involves having to do this all the time if you want to have any depth perception is not the most elegant. So can I come up with something better? Yes. Okay, so here's the first of my more sophisticated new eye designs. So imagine you have one eye, you have one pupil at the front, it has the cornea bending the rays as usual, it perhaps has an iris behind that, letting in more or less light as usual, pretty much like a human eye. But then on the retina, which is again pretty much like a human eye at the back, you have a stalk, and that stalk has a second retina on it. Now that stalk would be much closer to the cornea than the main retina, and so it would need a lens on the front of that second the second retina in order to keep things focused. So this stalk would reach forward and move around like that, and it's actually doing pretty much the same job as this. So the brain would compare the little picture, the depth picture that it got from this, and it would know how the world is moving correlating with that movement, and it would then compare that with the static picture that it's getting on the main retina, and then it would be able to work out what's near and what's far. So it's a bit like having a little imp inside your eye doing that, only it's doing that. There are drawbacks with this design, however. The first is that you've got a moving part, and moving parts wear out. But you know, maybe it is that this stalk gets tired and maybe even breaks off, and that old cyclopes, which is the hypercorrect plural of cyclops, they lose their depth perception, and so they seem particularly clumsy and old. Well, there you go. And that's perhaps a detail about cyclopes that you've just learned. If you accept something that's just been made up. So that's not really learning, is it? But anyway, another problem is that if the eyeball is filled with fluid, as our eyeballs are, then there'll be fluid resistance to that movement. But there's one way around that. You could just have it filled with gas instead. And yes, you can have bags of gas in nature. There are swim bladders in fish, and then there are those bags of gas that are the flotation devices for Portuguese man of war. Men of war? Do you say men of war? Man of war. Mans of war? Man of wars. Anyway, so a gas-filled eye is possible, or you could have one that's not actually under pressure, but the outside of the eyeball is actually made of bone. And so it doesn't actually need air pressure to keep it spherical, and it could have even a partial vacuum on the inside of it. So that's one way of solving the problem, to give depth perception. Oh, another problem, by the way, with that one is that there would, of course, as this moved around, it would be casting a shadow on the main retina, which would create a blind spot. But it's a blind spot that's constantly moving, so the brain could filter that out. We have blind spots in our vision, and yet we're not conscious of it. Admittedly, our blind spot is in the same place all the time, but I don't think it's beyond the possibilities of evolution for a brain to evolve the ability to get rid of a blind spot that's moving. It would know. The brain would know. Yeah, that shadow effect that goes round and round, that's caused by my own eye, and it could just compensate and filter it out. So I don't really see that as a huge problem. So that's one solution to the problem. But I think I can do better. How about taking inspiration from the spider? Now, spiders have eyes a bit like Greedo from Star Wars. You know, they don't blink, they're unblinking. It's just a fixed dome. They don't have an eyeball that turns within the head. Instead, they just have this dome, and it seems that nothing in there is moving. But actually, you could have something moving. You could have the retina behind the fixed cornea. So the cornea is that front window on the eye. If that's fixed onto the front of the head, unblinking and unmoving, you could have a muscular stalk behind it. And on the end of that muscular stalk, you could have another retina. And if you want to look left, instead of swiveling an eyeball to look left, you swivel this retina. You swivel the retina around to look left, and you can look right and up and down. And for focusing, you go in and out. So what if a stalk like that, which would have no blind spot, had a lot of little lesser depth perception retinas around it, arranged perhaps, as in this example, 12 around the main retina. Now, I've drawn them here dished like a human retina, although actually it occurs to me that perhaps they should be flat or even domed slightly the other way to reflect the curvature of the cornea. But that's a minor consideration. Let's not concern ourselves with that detail right now. So if you had something like that, you could then move in and out and look around, and this would give you depth perception, because all those little retinas around the main retina will be seeing slightly different versions of the world. And this, in comparison with the main retina, could then give the creature depth perception, and better than ours, because whereas we just have a left and right split, this would be maybe 12, maybe all points of the compass, perhaps 3 would be fine, but you could have more retinas around the central retina for better depth perception. Redundancy. Now, another drawback of this, however, is that front lens, that front cornea, that fixed cornea, is a bit vulnerable. Now, a spider seems to get away with this, but spiders are very small. And a big beast living in a cave this big vulnerable eye might be a problem. And another problem is that you've got no iris to regulate how much light is getting in or out of the eye. No, not out of the eye, getting into the eye. So there are several solutions to that. One being you don't mind because you live in a fairly low light world anyway, you're in a cave, and perhaps that means that when the cyclopes go outdoors on a sunny day, they're very dazzled, and the humans see them looking half blind and dazzled and clumsy again, and then think foolishly and wrongly that it'd be safe to go into a cave and take them on there because they're so clumsy and half blind. No, they're not when they're in the cave. Also, you could have an iris on each of the retinas. Or how about this? How about you just have an iris on the main central retina, but the outer ones don't? So when the cyclops goes outdoors on a sunny day, his depth perception is dazzled, but his main perception is not. Just a little sort of quirk of the cyclopes. But I've thought of perhaps a better solution, and this is one that makes the creature look more monstrous, because what you could have is you could have an eyelid that has skin and a central variable sphincter. Okay, so a bit like my mouth now, for instance. I can form it into a small hole or a big hole to let in a small amount of light or a big amount of light. So I could then move that small hole around like that. So you could have this wrinkly skin on the front of the eyeball, and this ugly sphincter that moves around and opens and closes on the front of the eye, in which case the beast would look something like this. Yes, I use myself as a model again. Why shouldn't I? So that's another possible way that a monster could look. And I think one of the reasons I like this particular design of Cyclops' depth perceiving eye is that it's feasible. It's ugly. It's really monstrous. You could perhaps, if you got close to the creature and it came right up to you and looked at you, you might actually see that weird cluster of retinas come to the front of its eye and stare at you, and that might be particularly inducing. Oh, now I said that this is a sponsored video. It is. It's sponsored by The Great Courses Plus, which has been sponsoring me for some while now. So it seems that it's a successful sponsorship. So thank you very much for responding to the sponsorship, and perhaps more of you will now. If you're interested in, for instance, biology, which is what I'm talking about now, and the design of things, anatomy and so forth, you might want to have a look at the course, which is called Understanding the Human Body. It's an introduction to anatomy, and it's 32 lectures of 3/4 of an hour each, which, if you do the maths, you'll realise is one whole day. Yes, 24 hours of anatomy lessons could be yours for free. That's right, because if you go to www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/Lindybeige, got there, then you'll find a landing page there which will explain to you how you can get 1 month's free. Now that's normal. People who've been watching my channel for a while know that that's the deal and offer. But now there's more. Oh yes, now not only can you get 1 month for free, but you can also get 3 months for half price. So that's an awful lot of lectures. Now, there are something like 7,000 lectures, which they've got on their database of science and cookery and photography and history and all those sort of things. Anything faintly academic, you're likely to find it there. About 7,000 lectures. So you couldn't normally imagine that you could do that in 1 month, but you know, 4 months, you know, you could get through an awful lot of lectures, and 3/4 of them for half price. So why not give it a go? So that's, see if I can do it in one go. www is such an incredibly stupid abbreviation, isn't it? World Wide Web. World Wide Web. 3 one-syllable words. W is a 3-syllable words. www is an abbreviation which is 3 times longer than the thing it abbreviates. But anyway, www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/Lindybeige. Yes. Now, back to the action. So, a third design is the prism design. Yes, now you could say, you can't have a prism in an eye, that's cheating. Oh yes, I can. I'm sorry, I can, because if starfish can have crystalline eyes, and if trilobites can have massive arrays of extremely precisely shaped crystal eyes, I can have one prism in a cyclops eye. And the prism, of course, splits light. So what you could have is light that comes in through the front of the eye as normal, and then hits one side of a prism. And then some of the light bounces off into the main eye, and that's the normal sort of eye. So it's got color perception, it's got all the rods and cones, so that's a full color vision perception eye, but it has no depth perception on its own. Some of the light diffracts into the prism and ends up going into a second, smaller depth perception eye. Now this one can only be black and white. Why only black and white? Why not make that one color as well? Because that wouldn't work, because as light goes through a prism, it splits into its component wavelengths, because all the different wavelengths of light actually bend by a different amount. So you can only use one of them for a clear picture. If you try to have a full color picture, it'd be horribly blurred, and that causes loads more problems. Besides, we don't need it. So this one is a smaller depth perception eye that just perceives a black and white. And here's the thing. The lens in front of the depth perception eye is constantly pulsing, whereas the other eyes behaving as our eyes do. Quite normally you focus on a thing and you pull focus onto it and you just stay there. But the pulsing one means that the picture is constantly going in and out of focus. But things that are far away will hardly be affected. They'll go out of focus, but yeah, they're so far away you can hardly notice it, whereas things close to you will go quite a lot out of focus and then sharp and match the other picture, and the brain could then put all that together and work out all the time using just one eye that can have an ordinary iris for regulating light levels. It can have ordinary eyelid just like a human eyelid, so we end up now with an eye that looks like your classic cyclops eye. It looks like a human eye, but it has depth perception because it has this second eye that is comparing the fuzziness and the sharpness of things that are close against things that are far away. So there you go. So there's a third design of cyclops eye, and you could it's not perfect, of course. You could say, well, you're losing a load of light. Some of the light comes into the eye and then that's taken away because of the inefficiency of the prism, and some of it has to then go into the depth perception eye, so the main eye is not seeing as much. Well, you could put a half mirrored surface on that side of the prism, and yes, you could have mirrors in nature as well. For instance, there's this pupa, which this particular species of butterfly has evolved to make it a mirror surface on the outside, so it reflects the leaves and so forth around it for camouflaging it. You wouldn't think that would particularly work well, would you? Making something incredibly bright and silvery, because we humans tend to notice things that are silvery. But anyway, clearly it does work in nature because this has evolved. So yes, I can have mirrors, and yes, I can have crystals. So it's evolutionarily feasible, this eye, and it would look like a human eye. And I'm reasonably proud of it because it's not an obvious design of eye, I put it to you. Now there are more. Now there are things called light field cameras, and the thing is, I'd like to explain to you how light field cameras work, but I've read now a fair amount about it and I really don't completely understand it. But it does seem that it would be perhaps feasible to have loads and loads of micro lenses immediately over the retina, which is what a light field has. It has loads of an array of micro lenses immediately over the light sensitive sensor in the back of it. And then your brain would have to do a huge amount of number crunching, just as computers do with these things. And it's then possible for the camera to be focused after the event of taking the photograph. So you take a photograph and then in post-production you can focus it. You can actually make one thing blurred and another thing that's further away become sharp. I know that's weird, isn't it? But light field cameras are coming on in leaps and bounds. At the moment they're not particularly useful or common, but perhaps as the price comes down and the technology improves, that we might then have cameras that you don't have to focus at the time, focus it later. But it does require the brain to do an awful lot of number crunching. But then again, brains are doing that all the time. It's quite staggering how much visual information that we perceive is actually put there by our brains making it up. The colour, for instance, only the centre of your eye can actually perceive colour properly. Your peripheral vision is actually all black and white, and yet you said, no it isn't, I can see colours in my peripheral vision. No, your brain's putting false colours in your peripheral vision based on what it remembered those colours as being when it did perceive them. Weird, isn't it? And something in your peripheral vision that moves, it really attracts your attention, doesn't it? Because your brain is looking out for that sort of thing. And there's actually a lot of shash, a lot of extraneous information in the vision, but your brain is removing all that and cleaning it up. And your brain is very good at detecting edges. Your brain has an edge detector and it's working out the 3D stuff all the time, and it's hiding the blind spot. The human brain's actually doing a huge amount of work to process the visual information coming into your eyes. So yes, maybe it's perfectly feasible, and you've got a big head on a cyclops, so you've got a big brain, so yes, maybe it's perfectly feasible for the microprocessor, the light field technology to come up with a depth perception eye. There you go. So what I've really talked about here is fantasy biology, but it is interesting to note that some biologists do actually go in for this sort of thing. They talk about, they're even the xenobiologists, they're talking about potential types of life on other planets even, speculating about how, for instance, almost, not all, but almost all creatures on Earth are symmetrical about one axis. Okay, starfish, for an example, they're an exception. But most creatures have a left side and a right side that is near enough symmetrical. But maybe two won't be the standard. Maybe there are planets where things tend to be divided into three. Just that's the standard body shape. There are people thinking about all sorts of different chemistries that could be used. So anyway, I'm digressing here at the end. I should be wrapping this up now, so I shall. So, cyclopes, maybe they're not as blind as you thought. Lindybeige!